In the shadows of ancient Rome's might and glory, one name echoes through the ages as a symbol of defiance: Spartacus. While most people know him from the hit TV series or Hollywood's classic films, the real Spartacus was far more than a rebellious gladiator. He was a revolutionary who shook the foundations of the Roman Republic. But who exactly was he? Spartacus was believed to have been born around 111 BCE in Thrace, a region that covers parts of modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Thracians were known as fierce warriors and skilled horsemen. It's unclear whether Spartacus was born free or into servitude, but historical sources, such as Plutarch and Appian, suggest that he once served as a soldier in the Roman army. However, for reasons that remain unclear, he was later enslaved, possibly for desertion or mutiny. After being captured, Spartacus was sold into slavery and trained as a gladiator in Capua, a Roman city notorious for its brutal training schools. Life in the gladiator arena was short, bloody, and humiliating. Yet, it was within this pit of despair that Spartacus began to organize and dream of something far greater: freedom not just for himself, but for all those bound in chains. The historical record tells us that around 73 BCE, Spartacus, along with about 70 other gladiators, staged a daring escape from their school using kitchen knives and stolen weapons. They fled to Mount Vesuvius, where they began to gather more slaves, peasants, and discontented individuals from across Italy. What started as a desperate run for survival quickly evolved into a full-scale slave rebellion, known in history as the Third Servile War. What makes Spartacus truly remarkable is not just that he escaped, but that he organized. Unlike other escapees who simply ran, Spartacus formed a disciplined force. He was elected as one of the leaders, alongside Crixus and Oenomaus, but it was Spartacus who became the face and heart of the rebellion. He wasn't driven by blind rage or chaos. Accounts suggest that Spartacus wanted to lead his followers out of Italy and back to freedom in their homelands. But as more and more slaves joined the cause, tens of thousands, that dream became harder to manage. What had begun as a prison break was now an open war against Rome. The Roman Senate had no idea what was coming. They thought they were dealing with a band of criminals. What they didn't realize was that Spartacus was a seasoned warrior, a tactician, and a man who had nothing to lose. And that made him dangerous. In the next episode, we'll dive into the moment everything changed, when the Roman Empire realized Spartacus wasn't just another escaped slave, but the leader of the most powerful rebellion they had ever seen. The rebellion of Spartacus didn't start with an army. It started with a kitchen knife. In the year 73 BCE, inside the walls of a gladiator training school in Capua, a small group of slaves and gladiators, led by Spartacus, decided they had enough of being beaten, humiliated, and forced to fight to the death for entertainment. These were men trained to kill, but more importantly, men with nothing left to lose. The breakout was swift and brutal. Armed with whatever they could find, kitchen tools, makeshift clubs, stolen blades, the group of about 70 to 80 gladiators overpowered the guards and escaped the school. They raided wagons and supply stations along the way, arming themselves with proper weapons as they fled. Their destination? Mount Vesuvius. The rugged terrain provided a natural defense and a temporary sanctuary. At first, Roman officials laughed off the escape. After all, what could a group of ragged slaves do against the might of Rome? But that arrogance would cost the empire dearly. As days turned into weeks, the group grew. More and more slaves from the countryside, oppressed farmers, and fugitives began to flock to Spartacus. It wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a movement. They didn't just want to run, they wanted to fight. Spartacus, with his co-leaders Crixus and Oenomaus, quickly began organizing the group. They weren't just a mob anymore, they were an army. Training resumed, not for arena combat, but for guerrilla warfare. They developed tactics, formations, and roles. This was no longer a group of desperate men. It was a force with direction. Rome, finally realizing the danger, sent a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber to crush the uprising. He surrounded Mount Vesuvius, cutting off Spartacus and his followers from escape. Glaber believed he had them cornered, but Spartacus saw something others didn't: opportunity. In a move that would be studied for centuries, Spartacus ordered his men to craft ropes and ladders from vines and climb down the steep cliffs of Vesuvius. On the side the Romans thought was impassable. Under the cover of night, they descended silently, then circled around and attacked Glaber's forces from behind. The Romans were slaughtered. The message was clear. This was no ordinary revolt. With weapons, supplies, and morale now at a high, Spartacus began leading his army across southern Italy. They struck Roman outposts, liberated towns, and gathered tens of thousands of followers. Farmers abandoned their lands to join him. Former soldiers defected. Slaves turned from tools into warriors. The rebellion was no longer a spark. It was a wildfire. What terrified Rome most wasn't just the growing size of the army, it was the discipline. Spartacus kept order, punished looters, and made it clear this was not chaos. This was a war for freedom. In the next part, we'll uncover how Spartacus took his army of former slaves and turned it into a terrifying military machine that outmaneuvered the greatest empire in the ancient world. By the end of 73 BCE, Spartacus's rebellion had grown far beyond anything the Roman Senate had imagined. What started as a daring escape by a few dozen gladiators had transformed into a full-scale slave uprising, with over 30,000 followers marching behind Spartacus. But how did a band of slaves become such a powerful army? The answer lies in leadership, desperation, and opportunity. Spartacus wasn't just a strong warrior, he was a brilliant strategist. Unlike other rebel leaders, he didn't allow chaos to rule. His camp was known for its discipline. He enforced rules, punished looters, and made sure civilians weren't harmed unless absolutely necessary. He understood that they weren't just fighting for revenge. They were fighting for legitimacy, and legitimacy required order. He also gave his men something they had never had before: hope. Most of them had been born into slavery or captured in wars and sold into bondage. They had lived their lives as property, but Spartacus made them believe they could be free, they could return home, and they could win. This hope attracted more and more people. Slaves fled villas and farms to join him. Poor peasants, beaten down by Rome's taxes and cruelty, saw a hero in Spartacus. Even some former Roman soldiers, disillusioned or impoverished, offered their swords. With each victory, Spartacus's legend grew, and with it, his numbers. But it wasn't just about numbers, it was about skill. Spartacus and his generals, especially Crixus, trained the army relentlessly. They took knowledge from their time as soldiers, gladiators, and prisoners, and applied it to real warfare. They taught discipline, ambush tactics, shield formations, and how to exploit Roman weaknesses. Most importantly, they were mobile. Spartacus's army didn't build cities or try to hold territory. They moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before the Romans could regroup. Their agility allowed them to defeat force after force sent by Rome, including entire legions. Rome was humiliated. These were supposed to be slaves, subhuman in the eyes of the elite, and yet they were outsmarting and defeating Rome's best-trained soldiers. Senators panicked. Rich Roman families fled the countryside. Rumors of rebellion spread across the empire. By early 72 BCE, Spartacus's forces had swelled to nearly 70,000. With such numbers, he could have tried to conquer Rome itself, but instead, he had another plan: to lead his people north, across the Alps, and back to their homelands in Thrace, Gaul, and Germania. But not everyone agreed. Crixus and a portion of the army wanted to stay and fight. They were thirsty for revenge. Spartacus allowed them to break off, but it would be a costly decision. In the coming months, Crixus and his men would face a tragic fate that would harden Spartacus forever. In the next episode, we'll follow that split in the army and the bloody consequences that would change the course of the rebellion forever. By early 72 BCE, the slave army was massive. Tens of thousands of former slaves, farmers, deserters, and outcasts now followed Spartacus. They had weapons, strategy, and victories under their belt. But unity? That was fragile. Crixus, one of Spartacus's closest allies and a fellow gladiator, had a different vision for the rebellion. While Spartacus wanted to lead the army north over the Alps and back to their homelands, Crixus was burning with vengeance. He didn't want to escape Rome, he wanted to destroy it. So the army split. Crixus broke off with around 30,000 fighters, mostly Gallic and Germanic warriors. They headed south, aiming to plunder Roman cities and draw blood. Spartacus, although hesitant, allowed it. He hoped they could reunite later, but Rome saw this division as its chance to strike. A Roman general named Lucius Gellius Publicola was sent to stop the rebellion. Unlike previous commanders, Gellius took the threat seriously. He moved swiftly, cutting off Crixus and his forces near Mount Garganus in southern Italy. What followed was a massacre. Crixus and his men, though brave and battle-hardened, were outmaneuvered. They fought valiantly, but without the full force of Spartacus's army, they were overwhelmed. Crixus was killed in the battle, his head reportedly presented to the Senate as a trophy. The Roman Senate celebrated. Finally, they had a victory to show the public. But their celebration was short-lived. Spartacus was enraged. He immediately turned south, abandoning his plans to cross the Alps. Some say he did it to avenge Crixus. Others believe he realized that escape was no longer possible, that Rome would never let them go. Either way, Spartacus led his army straight back into the heart of Italy, and what he did next sent a clear, bloody message to Rome. He captured over 300 Roman prisoners, and in a chilling act of revenge, he forced them to fight each other to the death, gladiator style, just as he and Crixus had once been forced to do. To Spartacus, it was justice. To Rome, it was an insult they couldn't ignore. At this point, the rebellion had transformed. Spartacus was no longer simply fighting for freedom. He was at war with the Roman state. His army began moving north again, but it was clear that Rome would never allow them to leave. The Senate poured more troops into the conflict. More legions, more money, more commanders. Spartacus continued to win battles, outsmart generals, and grow his forces. But the walls were closing in. The empire had finally recognized the scale of the threat, and it was preparing to crush it once and for all. In the next episode, we'll meet the man chosen by Rome to end the rebellion, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history, and the only one ruthless enough to take Spartacus down. By 71 BCE, the rebellion led by Spartacus was on the brink of its most critical moment. The slave army had faced defeats and losses, but their will to fight remained strong. Yet, after the fall of Crixus and the Roman Republic's growing resolve to end the uprising, the tide was turning. The Senate knew that they needed to bring in their most ruthless and capable general to crush Spartacus once and for all. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was no stranger to power. A man of extreme wealth and political influence, Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, known for his vast property holdings and control over the firefighting business in the city. But what Crassus was most famous for was his reputation as a ruthless and cunning military commander. Initially, Crassus had been overlooked as a possible leader in the fight against Spartacus. The Roman Senate had sent several praetors to handle the situation, but none had been able to capture the elusive rebel leader. When the Senate finally chose Crassus, they were desperate, and he, in turn, was eager for glory and a chance to cement his legacy. Crassus took immediate action. His first move was to drastically increase his army. Unlike previous commanders, who had only sent small contingents of soldiers, Crassus raised a massive force. He eventually commanded over 50,000 men, a combination of elite Roman legions, mercenaries, and newly recruited soldiers. But he knew sheer numbers wouldn't be enough to defeat Spartacus. He would need strategy, and he would need to be brutal. Crassus quickly employed a strategy that would change the course of the war. The decimation of his own troops. In a demonstration of his control and the necessity of discipline, Crassus had every 10th man in a legion killed as punishment for cowardice and disobedience. This brutal act instilled fear, but also loyalty in his soldiers. They feared him, and more importantly, they feared failure. As Crassus advanced south, Spartacus was forced to face the growing threat. The rebel army had suffered heavy losses, and their morale began to dwindle. Despite this, Spartacus was still a force to be reckoned with. He managed to outmaneuver Crassus a few times, using guerrilla tactics to harass the Romans and keep them on edge. However, Crassus was relentless. He had learned from his earlier mistakes and understood the importance of cutting off Spartacus's retreat. He began to close in on the slave army, blocking any paths to the north. The rebellion was nearing its final chapter. At the same time, the Spartan Roman Senate began sending reinforcements. Crassus's efforts were bolstered by another famous Roman general, Pompey the Great, who had been fighting his own battles in the western provinces. The combined forces of Crassus and Pompey now far outnumbered Spartacus and his followers. In the next part, we'll witness the final, catastrophic confrontation between the two sides. The Battle of the Salarius River will determine the fate of Spartacus and his army and set the stage for a brutal conclusion to the greatest slave revolt in Roman history. By the spring of 71 BCE, Spartacus's rebellion was approaching its tragic end. After years of evading Roman forces, outsmarting generals, and winning battle after battle, the slave army was on the brink of collapse. The Romans, under Crassus's relentless pursuit and the added strength of Pompey's legions, had finally cornered the once unstoppable rebel leader. The Battle of the Salarius River would decide the fate of Spartacus and his people. Spartacus had hoped to escape north across the Alps, but Crassus and Pompey had cut off his retreat. The rebel army, now desperate and hungry, was hemmed in on all sides. The slaves' morale had plummeted. Although their numbers were still formidable, their supplies were running out, and their leadership had been decimated by earlier defeats. Even Spartacus, the man who had inspired them all, could feel the weight of the rebellion's inevitable collapse. The final confrontation took place near the Salarius River, a key waterway in southern Italy, on the banks of which Spartacus had hoped to make a last stand. But Crassus had anticipated this move. He had studied the terrain, set traps, and positioned his forces to prevent any chance of escape. The battle was brutal. Spartacus, ever the brilliant tactician, fought with everything he had left, using the natural terrain to his advantage. He attempted to outflank Crassus's forces, hoping to split the Roman legions and create confusion. But the Romans had been trained for years in the art of warfare, and Crassus's legions were disciplined and formidable. Every move Spartacus made was countered swiftly and efficiently. For the slaves, the fight was not just for survival, it was for the very spirit of freedom that had led them to rebel in the first place. But their training, despite their fierce determination, could not match the professional Roman soldiers who had honed their skills in countless battles across the empire. At the height of the battle, Spartacus found himself surrounded by Roman soldiers. His men fought valiantly, but as the day wore on, the tide turned. The Roman forces, now bolstered by Pompey's legions, tightened their grip. The fighting was fierce, but ultimately, the slaves began to break apart. Desperation set in as they tried to flee, but the Roman soldiers had them trapped. In the chaos of the battle, Spartacus was killed. Some say he fell in the thick of the fighting, while others claim he was struck down by a Roman soldier. His death marked the end of the rebellion. The aftermath was horrifying. In total, over 6,000 of Spartacus's surviving followers were captured and crucified by the Romans. They were lined along the Appian Way, from Rome to Capua, a gruesome display meant to serve as a warning to any who would dare challenge the power of Rome. The bodies of the rebellious slaves were left hanging as a grim reminder of the consequences of defying the Roman Empire. But despite his death, Spartacus's legacy endured. His rebellion was a symbol of defiance against oppression, of hope for those without freedom. Though the revolt was crushed, it became an enduring tale of courage and resistance, one that would echo throughout history as a testament to the power of the human spirit. In the final part of our series, we'll reflect on the impact of Spartacus's rebellion on both the Roman Empire and the slaves who followed him, and why his story continues to inspire generations. The rebellion of Spartacus, though brutally crushed in the fields of the Salarius River, did not end with his death. In fact, the aftermath of his uprising became a powerful symbol, one that transcended the violent end of his army. The name Spartacus became synonymous with resistance, freedom, and the unyielding fight against oppression. His legacy would echo through the centuries, inspiring countless movements for liberty and justice. When Spartacus died in 71 BCE, his forces were shattered, and his body was lost to history. But the spirit of his revolt endured in the hearts and minds of slaves, oppressed peoples, and the disenfranchised. For Rome, his defeat was a triumphant moment, but it also left a lingering question. How could a small band of slaves, men who were supposed to be powerless, pose such a serious threat to the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? This question haunted Rome, as it did the ancient world. Spartacus's rebellion exposed the deep cracks in the empire's foundation, the brutal and dehumanizing institution of slavery that propped up its economy. While Rome celebrated its victory, it could not ignore the reality that the idea of freedom, once ignited, was difficult to extinguish. The rebellion also revealed something much deeper: the yearning for liberty that existed even among the most downtrodden. Spartacus, as a leader, tapped into that yearning. He had shown that even the most oppressed could rise up and fight back. The slaves who followed him had not been soldiers or warriors in the traditional sense, but they fought like ones, motivated by the promise of freedom and the idea that they could take control of their own destinies. In the centuries following Spartacus's death, his name became a rallying cry. In the medieval period, the story of Spartacus inspired revolts among the oppressed classes. During the French Revolution, the symbolism of the slave rebellion was invoked as a model of uprising against tyranny. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Spartacus was championed by workers' movements, anti-colonial struggles, and revolutionary groups across the globe, from Marxist ideologies to African liberation efforts. In popular culture, Spartacus's legacy has continued to shine. His story has been immortalized in literature, films, and television shows, most famously in the 1960 epic film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas, which portrayed the rebellion as a timeless struggle for freedom. The film made the phrase, "I am Spartacus," a symbol of unity and defiance. But Spartacus's impact wasn't confined to pop culture. It reached into the heart of social change. His life, though tragic and short-lived, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the capacity for resistance against overwhelming odds. His revolt might have ended in failure, but his fight resonated with the oppressed, the marginalized, and the exploited in every corner of the world. Today, Spartacus is remembered not just as a gladiator or a rebel, but as a universal symbol of resistance. His name still inspires movements seeking justice and equality, and his story remains a reminder that no matter how great the empire, no one is beyond the reach of those who dare to fight for freedom. In our final reflection, we honor the life of Spartacus, a man who, despite his defeat, showed the world that the fight for freedom was always worth fighting, even in the face of overwhelming odds.